on the windswept lands of the Dakota Plains, where every afternoon the wind whirls up red dust into tiny twisters. Eleanor Wade, a widow in her 30s, lives quietly on the ranch her late husband left behind. In that place, winters last longer than promises, and summers are so dry that even affection can crack like the earth itself. As her cattle grew fewer and loneliness gnawed at her nights, Eleanor did something few women would ever dare. She placed an ad, searching for a husband through letters, not for love, but for survival. Thousands of miles away, Jonathan Hale, once a gentleman of Boston's upper class, left everything behind: reputation, comfort, and pride to answer that letter. But could a man whose hands had never known the weight of soil survive among the wind, dust, and people who trusted only the calluses of their own palms? And Eleanor, did she truly need a man or just a presence? Something to fill the emptiness echoing inside that cold wooden house. If it were you, would you dare leave your familiar world behind and start anew in the wilderness? All because of a single letter. Hit like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. And join me as we step into the story of Eleanor and Jonathan, where love is tested by wind, earth, and faith. On the wide open land of Wyoming flats, where the sky seems endless and the wind never learns to rest. Margaret Lane lived alone in an old wooden house surrounded by sunburnt grasslands. Each morning, she woke before dawn, lit the stove with leftover coal from the night before, brewed herself a thin cup of coffee, and stepped out onto the porch gazing across the parched fields that stretched all the way to the horizon. Out there was nothing but wind, dust, and the creaking of the windmill, the only sound that reminded her she was still alive. Margaret once had a husband, Thomas Lane, a quiet man, kind eyes, always shadowed by the worry of harvests and cattle. Together, they had tamed this land for 10 long years. Then one winter, Thomas died in a blizzard, leaving her not only a ranch as vast as the eye could see, but also a hollow that nothing could ever fill. After the funeral, folks came by to offer comfort, to promise help, and then one by one, they disappeared. By the time spring returned, it was just her alone, with hungry cattle and a leaking barn. From that moment on, Margaret learned how to mend fences, haul water, lead horses, and keep the fire alive through moonless nights. She became practical, sharp-edged, and unyielding because out here on the frontier, softness doesn't keep anyone alive. Her nearest neighbors lived miles away. Some had moved on, others had been robbed or killed along the transport routes. And every time she looked west, toward the faint outline of the mountains, like the ghost of an old dream, she found herself wondering, were people ever meant to be this alone? Every day was a battle against work heavier than her strength, driving cattle across the river, hauling hay, fixing the windmill, patching the barn. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders sore, but her eyes stayed steady, glowing like the embers in her stove. And yet, on nights when the wind howled hard enough to rattle the windows, she would wake suddenly, clutching the blanket tight, as if searching for a warmth long gone. Then one early autumn morning, when the wind carried the damp scent of rare rain, Margaret sat down at the wooden kitchen table, opened an old-town newspaper from Silver Creek, and scanned the pages. Among the land sales, missing horse notices, and cough syrup ads, her eyes stopped on a small line that read mail-order marriages. Find companionship through correspondence. For gentlemen and ladies in the West seeking to share life and labor. At first, she laughed. A 40-year-old widow, with scarred hands and silver threads in her hair, writing a letter for a husband ridiculous. But when she looked outside, saw the windmill still and the broken fence, That laugh faded away. The truth was, she could no longer do it all alone. The ranch needed a man not for love, but to survive. Margaret pulled out a worn sheet of paper and a stub of pencil. She wrote plainly, "Without flowery words, I am a widow living in Wyoming flats. My ranch needs a man who is strong, honest, and willing to work. I promise no love, only fairness and respect. If you wish to start over, answer this letter." When she finished, she stared at the last line, the handwriting shaky but firm. Part of her still couldn't believe what she'd just done. Yet, as she sealed the envelope and placed it on the table, something stirred inside her, not hope exactly, but a different kind of breath, as if life itself was about to turn a new page she'd never dared to imagine. In the days that followed, Margaret went on with her usual chores, but each time she passed the mailbox by the gate, she lingered a little longer. That rusted box, which for years had held nothing but bills and receipts, now felt like a fragile doorway to something unknown. Maybe trouble, maybe a miracle. At dusk, as the sunset painted the prairie red, she stood facing the railroad tracks where freight trains sometimes passed, leaving behind trails of smoke drifting in the wind. In that moment, she realized, somewhere beyond those mountains, there might be a man looking this way too, carrying his own ghosts, his own need to begin again. A man not perfect, but searching for redemption. If that were true, could these two strangers, one seeking survival, the other seeking forgiveness, ever find each other here, under this vast sky, and rebuild faith in the human heart Margaret didn't know? But as the evening wind swept through, she quietly closed her door and smiled the first real smile in years. Whether it was a curse or a blessing, the letter was sent, and fate had begun to move just like the distant train rolling toward the horizon. And somewhere across America, in a small boarding room in Boston, a man was folding his last suit the moment he decided to leave the world of privilege behind, to answer the letter from that wild, wind-swept land. On the iron train rolling across the vast wilderness of the West, Edward Whitmore sat quietly by the window, his eyes tracing the golden plains stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The steam engine roared in steady rhythm, as if counting down the seconds to a new life, one whose destination even he could not yet name. Wind rushed in through the carriage door, carrying dust and the smell of coal, clinging to the silk collar that once knew only the scent of perfume and ballroom lights in Boston. Now, all of that seemed to belong to another man, one he had already buried in the past. Edward had once been the youngest son of a distinguished family. His father, a shipping magnate. His mother, a refined woman of high society. He grew up among the sound of waltzes and silver cutlery, taught to dance gracefully, to speak politely, and to behave like a gentleman. But no one had ever taught him how to stand up after losing everything. Oh, one night, after a failed investment destroyed the family company, Edward became a symbol of disgrace, the bankrupt son, the outcast, the man who drove his father to a fatal heart attack. His father's death was the end of everything he had ever known as safe. As gossip spread through Beacon Hill, old friends avoided him, and his elegant fiancée returned the engagement ring with a note that read simply, "You are no longer a man I can be proud of." Edward left Boston in silence, carrying only a small suitcase, a few clothes, and a bundle of letters among them. One from a distant land called Wyoming Flats, signed Margaret Lane. He had read that letter dozens of times. The handwriting was firm, the words plain. Without a trace of ornament, I promise no love. I need a man who is strong, honest, and unafraid of work. If you wish to start over, I await your reply. There was no sweetness, no promise of romance, yet that very simplicity made him pause. Perhaps because, for the first time in his life, he was being invited not to be a gentleman, but simply a man. And so, he wrote back, not seeking love, but a chance to rebuild, to exist without the glitter of wealth or the weight of a name. The journey took 4 days and nights, carrying him from a world of crystal glasses and gaslight chandeliers into a land of wind, dust, and hoofbeats. At each stop, he saw sunburned faces, calloused hands, and women hauling water under a frozen dawn. Edward realized these people lived more honestly than anyone he had ever met in Boston. Inside the train car, he watched silently farmers dozing beside their sacks, a young mother humming to her baby through tears, a one-armed veteran staring at a faded photograph. All of them were heading west to a place where no one asked, "Who were you?" but rather, "Who can you become?" That question echoed in Edward's mind, over and over, like a heartbeat. As the train pushed deeper into the frontier, the scenery changed. Cornfields faded into endless grasslands, and distant blue mountains rose on the horizon. The wind howled through the cracks of the carriage, sharp and cold. Edward tightened his coat and looked down at his hands once used to sign contracts, now destined to hold a shovel, lead a horse, and mend fences. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. Will she be disappointed when she sees me? He pictured the woman behind that letter, a widow, surely strong and unyielding, just like her words. He didn't know her face, but he knew she wasn't like anyone from his old world. And perhaps that was exactly why he was coming. On the third night aboard the train, while the passengers slept, Edward stayed awake, gazing out at the moonlit plains. Silver light spilled over the land, glinting on the faint patches of last season's snow. He reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph. His father, stern in a black suit. "I'll start over. Father," he whispered, his voice nearly drowned by the grind of steel wheels. "This time, I'll do it with my own hands." When dawn finally broke, the train slowed. Its whistle echoed through the valley, a long, lonely call of welcome to the new land. Through the haze of dust appeared a small sign, Silver Creek Station. Edward gathered his belongings, heart heavy yet strangely light. Before stepping off, he took out Margaret's letter, smoothed its folds, and tucked it close to his chest, a silent promise to himself. The platform was small, a few townsfolk hauling cargo under the harsh wind. It whipped open his coat, and for the first time, Edward felt the true scent of the West, the smell of earth, of wind, and of solitude. Far off, through the swirl of red dust, he saw the silhouette of a woman on horseback. She wore a dark brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat, her posture straight, every movement deliberate. Even from a distance, he could sense the strength in her presence. Edward's heart pounded. He knew, without a doubt, this was Margaret Lane, the woman whose letter had made him leave an entire world behind. And in that moment, he understood he wasn't just arriving in a new land. He was drawing closer to the truest version of himself. And there, on that dust-covered platform, when the eyes of two strangers met for the very first time, one seeking survival, the other redemption fate began to turn its wheels again, like a train that has stopped moving, but whose echo still hums through the wind. That afternoon, the Silver Creek Station lay under a fine red dust floating in the air like mist, settling on every wooden plank and every traveler's coat as they stepped off the train. The wind swept in from the grasslands, carrying the scent of dry earth and the metallic clatter of iron striking iron. Margaret Lane stood by the wooden fence, gripping her horse's reins tightly, her eyes following the passengers as they disembarked one by one. Inside her, a feeling half of anticipation, half of unease began to rise like standing before a storm without knowing whether it would bring rain or just dust. She studied each face, searching for someone who might resemble the man from the letter she had imagined through so many sleepless nights. In her mind, he had broad shoulders, sunburned hands, and the eyes of a man who'd lived through hard years. But when the train gave its final whistle, only one man remained on the steps, tall, straight-backed, wearing a dark coat and a spotless white collar that looked out of place in this dusty world. Margaret's fingers tightened on her hat brim. That couldn't possibly be him. The man Edward Whitmore stepped down, one hand gripping a leather suitcase, the other shading his eyes beneath a felt hat. He looked around until his gaze met hers sharp, guarded, and unflinching. For a brief moment, the two strangers faced each other, divided by a thick silence made of distance and doubt. Margaret spoke first. "You're the man who wrote to me." Her voice was low, husky, and edged with uncertainty. Edward nodded slightly, forcing a faint smile, though to her, that smile only made him seem softer, too clean, too polite, too untouched by the kind of life that left dust in your lungs and calluses on your palms. His black shoes gleamed, reflecting the afternoon sun, and she frowned. "You're not what I pictured," she said flatly, "though without malice." Edward glanced around, then bowed his head. "Just a little. I'm afraid. I don't quite know what I'm supposed to look like to please you." He paused, his voice gentling, as though afraid to bruise the fragile hope he carried. "But I can learn." That sentence, simple as it was, made Margaret look at him differently. Behind his weariness and unease, there was a quiet determination, not of a man trying to impress, but of someone clinging to his last chance at redemption. Still, she wasn't ready to believe. "Life here isn't easy," she said. "This land isn't soft like a ballroom floor in Boston, and people here don't bow just because you speak kindly." Edward nodded, calm and steady. "I don't need anyone to bow," he said. "I just need work." Margaret turned away, hiding the flicker of emotion in her eyes. She motioned for him to follow. As Edward stepped closer, the dust clung to his trousers, dulling the fine fabric, and for the first time since he'd boarded the train, he felt he no longer stood apart from this place. They rode back to the ranch, a long, empty road flanked by pale, dying grass. Overhead, a hawk cut through the sky with a sharp cry. Neither spoke for the entire ride. Margaret kept her eyes fixed on the reins, while Edward struggled to stay balanced in the saddle, a task that seemed simple enough, yet left him drenched in sweat. At the ranch gate, she halted and spoke without turning her head. "You can stay in the barn tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'll give you work. If you're still here after a week, I'll consider letting you stay longer." Edward answered softly, "Yes, Miss Lane." She turned to glance at him. The way he said it made her frown. That trace of upper-class courtesy, the kind that had once grated on her during her late husband's more formal days, stirred something half-forgotten inside her. But she quickly buried it, nudged her horse, and rode ahead. That night, Edward lay on an old mattress in the barn. The smell of dry hay and leather thickened the air. Through a crack in the wooden wall, he saw the faint glow of lamplight still burning in the main house. She was awake. He wondered what she was thinking. Was she regretting the letter she'd sent? But he also knew if he left now, there was nowhere left to return to. This land, strange and harsh as it was, might be the only chance he had to reclaim his honor and to find a reason to live again, inside the house. Margaret sat alone at the table, the oil lamp casting gold light across her face, the face of a woman who had once loved, once lost, and now trusted only her own strength. She poured more coffee, bitter and black, and as she drank, a phrase echoed in her mind, "I can learn." Those 3 words circled back again and again. Can learn, can change. Could a person truly learn to become someone else? After a lifetime spent in warm rooms and glittering halls, Margaret didn't have an answer. She only knew that tomorrow she would try to see whether a man whose hands had never known calluses could endure the wind, the sun, and the raw truth of this land. And if he gave up, at least she'd know she wasn't the only one still fighting to keep life alive out here. Outside, the wind whistled through the fence. The barn door creaked softly. Somewhere in the night, 2 people, one who had lost everything, and one long accustomed to loneliness, were beginning the first chapter of something they did not yet dare to name. The next morning, as the sun rose over the rolling hills, Margaret stepped into the yard. Straw hat in hand, she saw Edward clumsily mending the fence, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt. For a moment, she almost laughed, not out of mockery, but because in that awkward struggle, there was something so human, so fragile, that for the first time in years, she felt the faint stir of belief returning. At dawn the next morning, a veil of mist lay over the prairie, like a faded wool blanket stretched across the earth. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and damp soil through the cracks of the barn doors. Margaret Lane had been awake for hours. She stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, her eyes fixed on Edward Whitmore, who was struggling to mend the fence. His figure, lean but upright, stood against the haze, like an unfinished stroke on the canvas of the western sky. She said nothing, only watched. Last night, she had barely slept, half out of habit, half because of the words still echoing in her head. I can learn. This morning, she intended to see whether he truly could. The wooden rails broken by last season's storm still lay scattered. Edward was trying to fasten them with wire, but every time he pulled tight, it snapped and cut his hand. Blood welled up, yet he only winced, then kept working. Those hands, Margaret thought, were made for signing contracts, not holding a hammer. He was clumsy, slow, sometimes so awkward it made her want to snatch the hammer and finish the job herself. But she didn't. Instead, she folded her arms and watched silent, like an observer of a private battle, not between man and land, but between man and his own pride. By noon, Edward was about to take off his gloves when she approached, her tone flat and cool. Quitting early? Are you out here? Folks stop only when the sun does. Edward looked up, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. I was only wiping the sweat, he said hoarsely. I'm not done yet. She studied him, then nodded toward the corral. This afternoon, take Ranger down to the river. Let him drink, then bring him back to the east stable, and don't let him drag you into the stream. The last line sounded like a warning and a test. Ranger was a stubborn horse, one that obeyed no one but her. Margaret turned away, leaving him to the wind, the sun, and his trial. It took Edward nearly half an hour to get the saddle on. When he led the horse out, the animal tossed its head, nearly unseating him. He didn't shout, didn't strike. He simply murmured, We'll have to work together, my friend. His voice was soft, almost gentle, and though the horse couldn't understand, somehow it quieted. The rope loosened, the resistance faded, and they walked side by side toward the river. From a distance, Margaret saw the scene. She said nothing, but surprise flickered in her chest. The man might not know how to handle a horse, but he had something most men around here lacked: patience. These plains were full of men who conquered. Few knew how to listen. By sunset, Edward came back covered in mud, his face darkened by dust and sun. She stood by the doorway, her look half critical, half concerned. "I thought you'd come back empty-handed," she said. He smiled, weary, but genuine. Almost did. He replied, "Ranger taught me that strength isn't about how hard you pull. It's about knowing when to let go." Margaret paused. There was something in that answer, a quiet depth that most men in this land would never understand. That evening, in the small kitchen, she set a bowl of thin soup in front of him. "Eat," she said. "Tomorrow, there's more work." Edward nodded gratefully and ate in silence. Neither spoke. Only the wind outside and the faint clink of the spoon against the bowl broke the quiet. Yet somehow, the air between them no longer felt as cold. The next morning, the test continued. Margaret handed him a rope. "Drive the cattle across the southern field," she said. "Don't let them scatter. And remember, they're smarter than you think." Edward nodded. Already used to her curt tone, he worked without complaint. When a cow butted him, he steadied himself, took a breath, and tried again. When the rope burned his palms, he wrapped it with scraps of cloth. Every cut, every bruise, every bead of sweat, it all felt like a kind of penance. A way to reclaim himself from the years he'd lived blind under the glow of excess. By dusk, Margaret came to check on him. The herd was safely corralled. Edward sat by the fence, hands trembling, blood seeping through the bandage, but his eyes were different now, steady, unflinching. "When do you plan to stop?" she asked. He looked up and gave a faint smile. "When you tell me I've done enough." For a moment, she said nothing. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not pleading, not flattering, just plain truth, from a man proving himself with his hands. That night, as a cold wind swept the prairie, Margaret noticed a faint light glowing from the barn. She walked over and found Edward sitting beneath a lantern, patching the saddle. His hands shook, but each stitch was straight and firm. "You don't have to do that now," she said softly. Edward looked up, his voice warm and steady. "If I don't learn tonight, I'll make the same mistake tomorrow, and I don't want you to be disappointed." Margaret was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "I've never met anyone who asked to learn how to fail." He smiled, tired, but honest. "Because only through failure," he said, "I know I'm finally living." Outside, the wind hissed through the fields, carrying the scent of hay and dust. Inside, two souls, one afraid to trust, the other afraid to lose faith, sat separated by nothing more than a flickering flame. Yet the distance between them seemed to be shrinking. Margaret looked at his blistered hands and felt something stir, not pity, but a quiet respect. She stood, pausing at the door. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll fix the windmill. Let's see if you've still got enough strength left to keep learning." Edward nodded. "I'll be there before sunrise." She turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. Without looking back, she whispered almost to herself, "Maybe you really are learning?" And as dawn breaks once more, with the wind whispering across the plains. Margaret will begin to speak for the first time about what she's lost her late husband, her loneliness, and the faith that once betrayed her. It will be the moment she finally lets someone step past the fence around her heart. That night, the wind swept across the prairie, carrying the faint scent of smoke and burnt grass. The sky was dark, so dark that only the campfire's glow flickered on their faces. Margaret Lane sat across from Edward Whitmore, holding a tin cup still steaming with coffee. They had worked all day fixing the windmill, cleaning the stables, gathering broken planks. Sweat, dust, and scratches had blurred the distance between them, but some wounds deeper, quieter, still waited in the dark, untouched. Margaret stared into the fire, the light dancing in her eyes like old memories stirring awake. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice calm and steady, as if pulling words from somewhere long buried. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "why I put out that ad for a husband?" Edward looked up, but said nothing. He knew some questions didn't need answers. They only needed the courage to be spoken aloud. 3 years ago, Margaret began, this ranch wasn't just mine. Thomas, my husband, built every fence, every windmill with his own hands. He wasn't the strongest man, but he had a way of making the land trust him. Then one winter, his horse threw him while he was hauling lumber. I found him on the hillside, still warm, but no breath left. She paused, drawing in a deep breath. The fire cracked softly, its glow touching her skin, not dramatic, just quietly revealing the old scar beneath. After the funeral, I hired help, paid fair, too. But out here, a widow is an easy target. Her voice grew husky. One night, a drunk broke into the house. I fired a warning shot, saved myself. Since that night, I've locked every door and learned to need no one. Edward said nothing. The wind shifted, tilting the firelight so her shadow fell across the barn wall, small but unyielding, like the land itself. He understood now why her tone was edged with steel, why her eyes carried distance. She wasn't cruel. She was someone who'd been forced to become strong. Margaret continued, slower now, as if each word had to cross a barrier she'd built long ago. I don't want anyone's pity. I've had enough of that look. All I need is someone who, if he stays, stays, because he wants to keep this place alive with me, not out of guilt, not because he thinks I'm weak. Edward looked into the fire, then at her hands, sun-darkened, calloused, lined with tiny cuts from thorns and tools. He didn't know what to say without breaking the fragile quiet between them. Finally, he spoke softly. I didn't come here out of pity. I came because I need somewhere to stand still too. Margaret lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes. There was no pity in them, only a reflection of something she'd long tried to hide, the fear of being forgotten. That's easy to say, she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. But a person only truly stands still when they can stay even inside the pain. Edward nodded, as if accepting a challenge. Then I'll learn that too, he said. I've been running long enough. Her eyes flickered, and she turned away. The wind made the fire flare, sparks rising and vanishing into the night sky. They sat in silence for a long time, with only the crackle of the flames and the hum of insects between them. After a while, Margaret rose, pulling her coat around her shoulders. It'll get cold, she said. You should rest. Tomorrow, you'll haul water to the west field. Edward nodded, but didn't move. His eyes followed her until her shadow disappeared into the dark. He couldn't quite name what he was feeling. Respect, compassion, maybe something deeper, the quiet bond of two souls who had both lived outside the walls of trust. The night deepened. Above, the Milky Way stretched across the sky, a glowing scar in the blackness. Edward leaned back, exhaled a thin plume of breath, and thought, maybe peace isn't found by running from the past, but by daring to touch it, even when it hurts. He realized that tonight she had shown him the root of loneliness, something that no words could heal, only honest presence could ease. Inside the wooden house, Margaret sat by the window, watching the last embers of the fire fade. She thought about Edward's words, "I need somewhere to stand still." It had been so long since she'd heard someone talk about staying, not leaving. Maybe only those who had lost everything could truly understand the weight of not running anymore. She sighed, closed the window gently, and for the first time in months, she left the lamp burning through the night. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the barn roof, glinting off the rope in Edward's hands as he tightened the knots. Margaret stepped out, watched him for a moment, and said quietly, "It's time. If you truly mean to stay, then we'll make it official." And so, their story moved into a new chapter, a marriage born not of love, but of endurance, and the slow, fragile rebuilding of trust. That morning, the sky was unusually clear. The first sunlight spread across the prairie, pale gold like a thin shawl draped over the vast Wyoming flats. The wind whispered through the newly built fences, sounding like the land's slow, patient breath, steady, enduring, tinged with sorrow. Margaret Lane stood on the porch, holding the freshly signed marriage paper. Beside her, Edward Whitmore was silent, his eyes fixed on the endless horizon stretching beyond the fields. There were no flowers, no rings, only the scratch of a pen on paper, and the quiet agreement of two souls who no longer believed in sweet promises. Margaret spoke first, her tone steady and firm, more like reading a contract than making a vow. "I don't promise love, Edward. I promise fairness. You work. I'll share. You keep your word. I'll give respect. The rest, we'll let time decide." Edward nodded without lifting his gaze. "I couldn't ask for more." She studied him, a man thinner now, sun-darkened from labor under open skies. No longer the polished Boston gentleman. Before her stood an ordinary man, flesh and bone, with blistered hands and eyes that still held a quiet light. The old minister from Silver Creek read the brief marriage rite, plain and simple. He looked at them both and said, "You've agreed. That's enough. God knows what's in a person's heart better than any vow." When he left, only the two of them remained in the yard. The wind carried the scent of dry grass sharp and clean. Margaret folded the papers and looked at Edward. "From today, you're part of this household, but don't expect indulgence or forgiveness if you slack off." Edward gave a faint smile, not to charm her, but as a quiet acceptance of truth. "I've never expected things to be easy. I only hope to truly begin." And so they began not with love, but with duty. The days that followed unfolded steadily, as though nothing had changed. Edward rose early to cut hay, feed the horses, and check the windmill. Margaret prepared breakfast, but never waited for him. Their words were few, their greetings often just a nod. At first, the neighbors gossiped. They said Margaret had married an Eastern man out of loneliness, that Edward came for bread, not for devotion. Rumors spread like wildfire across the plains. But neither of them seemed to care, perhaps because they had long grown used to being judged. For Edward, those first weeks were pure trial. His hands swelled, his shoulders burned from hauling water and chopping wood. Yet he never complained. Every time he stumbled, he got back up. And Margaret, outwardly cold, began to notice something different in him. He wasn't skilled, but he possessed something she'd thought the world had lost the will not to quit. One afternoon, while Edward was repairing the barn roof, a sudden storm rolled in. Rain lashed the fields. Wind howled through the rafters. Still, he climbed higher, bracing the boards as they threatened to fly loose. Margaret ran out, shouting, "Are you trying to get yourself killed? Get down from there." Edward didn't turn. "If I don't do it, who will?" he yelled back through the storm. "You can't carry the whole damn world by yourself." Margaret. The words hit her like a blade, cutting through the walls she'd built around herself. She stood there in the rain, watching him soaked, trembling, yet holding tight to the beam. And in that instant, she realized perhaps he hadn't come just to live, but to show her that someone could still stay even without the promise of love. When the storm finally eased, they sat together under the porch, drenched and shivering, as though they'd survived something more than weather. Margaret handed him a cup of hot coffee, her voice softer. "You should rest a few days," she said. "The windmill can wait." Edward shook his head, his hands trembling around the cup. "No, I've rested too much in my life. Now, I just want to keep going." She looked at him, said nothing. Only the drip of rain from the roof, and the scent of wet earth rising, the smell of life, of beginnings without roses, but rooted in something truer, something lasting. Weeks passed. The house began to change. In small ways, the doorframe straightened. The fences stood firm. The horses grew well fed. But what Margaret noticed most was the absence of silence. When Edward passed by, she could hear him whistling, sometimes humming a wistful tune from the east. She never asked about it, but each time she heard it, her chest felt a little lighter, though she couldn't explain why. One night, under a pale moon, Margaret sat at the table balancing her ledger. Edward came in, carrying a bundle of firewood. He hesitated, then said quietly, "I know this isn't what you wanted, but thank you for giving me a chance, even if it's just to work." Margaret looked up, her gaze softening. "I didn't give you a chance, Edward. We're just keeping each other from falling apart." He nodded, understanding. But both knew some truths didn't need to be spoken, like the fire flickering in the hearth, not bright, but warm enough to keep the cold at bay. That was their marriage. No flowers, no rings, no vows of love, only soil, sweat, and a trust quietly built, day by day. And as the days turned colder, when the first snow began to fall, Edward learned to ride, to harvest, to tend the cattle as if their lives were his own, beneath gray skies and whistling winds. His journey to learn how to live truly began as the man from the city slowly became part of the land, the wind, and the untamed frontier he once feared. The first summer on Wyoming flats began with dry winds and the smell of burning grass rolling across the prairie. The sun hung above like a nail of fire hammered into the sky, and the earth split into hard, iron-colored cracks. It was in that harsh season that Edward Whitmore truly began to learn how to live, not with the mind of a man who'd read too many books, but with the hands of someone fighting simply to survive. Since the day they'd signed the marriage paper, Margaret Lane treated him no differently than a hired hand. She wasn't gentle because he was her husband, nor harsh to prove anything. To her, work was the measure of courage, and if he could withstand this life, then naturally he belonged here. Each morning, Edward rose while the sky was still brushed with silver. He brewed coffee, breathed in the smoke that drifted through the cold air, and began his day. At first, he didn't know how to lead a horse without startling it. He was kicked down more than once, gored by a cow into the mud, had ropes tear the skin from his wrists. But he never complained, just a quiet sigh. Then back to work. Margaret often stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching. She didn't help, didn't scold, only observed. She'd seen plenty of men quit before, but Edward was different, clumsy, slow, but never angry. He spoke little, listened much, and when he failed, he corrected himself without blaming the weather or the land. Once, when they were checking the water line on the western field, Edward asked, "How do you know there's still water under the ground?" When the surface is this dry, Margaret pointed to a patch where the grass grew thicker. The earth always tells you if you're willing to look, but city men rarely look at the earth. Edward, they only look in mirrors. He fell silent for a long time. Maybe because all his life he'd done just that, adjusted his collar, smoothed his hair without ever thinking to look down at the very thing keeping him alive. By noon, the sun burned so fiercely that the air itself shimmered. Together, they harvested wheat, laid it out to dry, led the cattle to water. His hands blistered, his shoulders raw. Yet in his eyes something new began to take root, as if his old pride was being quietly washed away. One afternoon, with golden fields waving in the wind, Margaret saw him trying to ride alone. The horse ranger, the same stubborn beast she'd once taught him to lead, still fought him every step. It jerked, bucked, bolted. Edward hit the ground hard, dust flying around him, but he didn't shout. He stood up, brushed himself off, and tried again. The fifth time, the sixth, the seventh, until, just as the sun touched the hills, Ranger finally let him mount. Margaret watched a man in a torn shirt, sweat-soaked, riding across the field under a blood-red sunset. He didn't smile, but she knew in that moment he'd found what he'd been searching for all along, a new faith in himself. That evening, they ate dinner in silence. She placed an extra piece of cornbread on his plate, without a word. He looked up and smiled, not politely, but genuinely. "You know," he said softly, "back in Boston, they call work an obligation. Out here, I think it's a blessing." Margaret nodded slowly. "Now you understand." From that day on, he learned with quiet persistence. He learned to herd cattle, to listen to their hooves and sense when they'd start to stray. He learned to harvest wheat so the blade wouldn't bruise the grain. He learned to read the sky, to tell when the wind was about to turn. Some days ended in failure, with him sitting in the mud, exhausted, rain pouring down his back. But by dawn, he was always there again, shovel in hand, eyes steady as if he were chasing down the lost pieces of himself. Margaret said little, but inside, something shifted. She no longer saw Edward as the man who came because of a contract, but as someone slowly woven into the rhythm of the land. She realized he wasn't just learning how to live, he was learning how to belong. One late August evening, they stood together by the well, watching the clear water flow from the earth. Edward turned to her and asked quietly, "Do you ever think, maybe I came here not because you needed me, but because I needed to find myself?" Margaret looked at him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Maybe this land knew that before either of us did." The wind carried the soft chime of the bell hanging on the porch. She said nothing more and walked away. But inside, for the first time in years, she felt peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but from knowing that someone was truly trying to stay, not running when the land turned cruel. That night, under the wash of moonlight over the prairie, Margaret sat by the window, watching Edward light a lantern near the barn. She saw him grin to himself as Ranger lowered its head for feed. That small and a golden light, fragile and warm, made the space around her feel alive again, like a single candle burning through a long, cold night. But as every wild land must test those who dwell upon it, that summer brought more than heat and sweat. It brought the first true storm, a storm that rolled in from the horizon, thunder roaring like fate itself. And within that storm, Edward would face the question that would define him. Had he truly become part of this land, or was he still just a wanderer, seeking shelter between the wind and the dust? That afternoon, the sky over Wyoming flats began to sink, heavy as a blanket weighted with stone. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Lightning split the still air, and thunder rolled like the growl of something ancient beneath the earth. The wind rose sharp, relentless, rattling the fences until the wooden posts groaned like the land itself was crying. Edward Whitmore was gathering hay in the far field when he felt the change in the wind, a warning. He looked up and saw the crows flying low, and the horses pacing nervously in their stalls. From the porch, Margaret Lane noticed it too. She dropped the broom and ran out. "The wind's turning. The storm's coming from the south," she said, breath quick with tension. Edward nodded, no questions, no hesitation. Both of them moved fast. He gathered what hay he could while she secured the barn doors. The sky darkened with each heartbeat. Thunder boomed like drums from the deep, and the wind whipped the ground so fiercely that sand stung their faces like needles. "Drive the herd into the north pen," Margaret shouted over the roar. Edward didn't waste a word. He ran, boots sinking in mud, shirt plastered to his back. Lightning flashed. The field went white for an instant, then black again. The cattle bawled in panic, slamming against the fences, the sound echoing like chaos itself. He waved the rope, shouting, pushing forward through the storm. Every step was a battle, every breath a test. Rain poured down in sheets, the wind howling so loud it drowned thought. In one blinding flash, Margaret saw him wrestling the lead bull mud splashing up his chest, his hands gripping the reins with desperate strength. She ran toward him. "Get back inside!" he yelled through the thunder. "It's too dangerous," she shouted back, defiant. "This is my land. Edward, I won't run from it." For a split second, their eyes met fierce, unyielding, a spark of trust inside the storm. Then they turned back to the work that could not wait. They fought the wind and rain for hours, until the storm finally tore itself out, leaving the prairie shredded and raw. When the air went still again, Edward stood in the yard, chest heaving. The south fence was broken. Half the barn roof was gone. The hay, their lifeline for winter, scattered to the wind. Margaret stepped forward, her face streaked with mud, hair clinging to her cheeks. She looked at the wreckage, her shoulders sagging. "All that work, gone," she whispered. Edward said nothing. He picked up a splintered board and began hammering it back into place. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "The storm's barely passed." He cut her off, his voice low but steady. "If we stop now, the wind wins, and I don't intend to let it win." The words struck her simple, solid, like a promise forged in iron. For a moment, her vision blurred, not from weakness, but from memory. Thomas, her late husband, had once said nearly the same thing. This land only belongs to those patient enough to endure it. At dawn, Edward was already at work. He gathered what hay remained, rebuilt the fences, helped her relay the roof. His hands were torn and bleeding, but he never paused. Margaret joined him, silent, driven by something beyond duty. By midday, under a hard sun, they had repaired what they could. No words were spoken, only the rhythm of two people working side by side, bound by something deeper than comfort survival. But the storm had left behind another kind of trial. 3 days later, Margaret found a few of the cattle acting strangely, eyes red, labored breaths, bodies collapsing in the dust. The sickness spread fast, as merciless as fire in dry grass. "No, not now," she whispered, her trembling hands touching the fevered hide of a dying cow. Edward knelt beside her. "Could be foot-and-mouth fever," he said quietly. Her head snapped toward him. "You know how to treat it." He shook his head. "No, but I know this: if we don't separate them, the whole herd dies." Panic flickered across her face. "We don't have a spare pen, not enough wood, not enough help." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, firm. "Steady. Then I'll build one. Out west. Don't say we can't. Margaret, we survived the storm. A sickness won't break us. For the first time." She didn't argue. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. That night, they worked under the lantern light. Edward built a rough fence. Margaret boiled herbs, cleaned wounds, mixed what little medicine she could. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the bitter tang of sickness, yet somewhere within that hardship, something new began to form, a thread between them unseen but strong, binding two people who once called each other nothing more than allies. When the disease finally eased, Margaret sank to the ground, exhausted. She looked at Edward, a man now shaped by this place, clothes torn, skin burned, eyes steady as ever. "You've done more than I expected," she said softly. He gave a tired smile. "I only did what needed doing. Sometimes doing is the only way to know you're still alive." She smiled faintly, small, rare, and real. Outside, the sky cleared. The air smelled of rain, and new earth, sweet, peaceful. Edward stood, looking over the half-repaired fields, and said quietly, "Your farm's alive again. Margaret," she looked up at him, "know our farm." In that moment, no vow was spoken, no declaration made, only the quiet truth of two people who had stayed, endured, and built something neither had planned, a shared life, born not from love, but from the courage to remain. After that storm, the ranch seemed reborn. But more than the land itself, it was the way they looked at each other that had changed. In the rare calm that followed, Margaret began to notice something strange. She no longer counted the days just to survive the season. She began to wait for morning, for the sight of him stepping into the yard, smiling beneath the first light of day. And that was when the first seed of faith quietly took root in her heart. The sun was sinking behind the Absaroka Range, bathing the whole stretch of Wyoming flats in deep amber. The air still carried the heaviness of rain and earth after the storm. Yet in that fading light there was a strange calm, the kind that only comes after people have met suffering face to face and survived it. Margaret Lane stood in the middle of the field, where the new fences still smelled of raw pine, watching the cattle wander slowly back to the barn. She could hear the land breathing again, the quiet gurgle of the creek, the steady crunch of hooves, and beneath it all, the sound of Edward Whitmore's footsteps approaching. He was no longer the bewildered man who had arrived by train from the east. His hands were calloused and darkened by sun, his shirt frayed at the shoulders, his boots dusted gray. Yet in his eyes, that clear, unwavering light, there was something that made her turn away before he could see the flicker of emotion that rose unbidden. In the weeks after the storm, they had worked without rest. They rebuilt the barn roof, saved half the herd, restored the water line. When neighbors from Silver Creek came to ask how she was, Margaret only said, "We're fine." She said we, not I and Edward, had heard it. That evening, when the day's labor was finally done, she stood watching the sun dip low, its rays falling across his shoulders. The sky blazed. The dusk glowed in the light like faint smoke. Her voice broke the silence, low and warm. "You're not a guest any more." "Edward." He stopped, looked up at her. The wind caught the hem of her dress, lifted it slightly. In that moment, wordless. Still, they both knew something between them had shifted. Quiet, but profound. He smiled, easy now, unguarded. Then, "I suppose that makes me officially hired." She laughed a small, real laugh that seemed to still the air itself. "No one's hired here. Everyone just does their share." Edward dipped his head. "Then I'll do mine until you tell me to leave." Margaret met his eyes, her voice softening. "I don't think I want to tell you that anymore." Silence settled again, warm and full. In the distance, the windmill creaked. The wind rolled through the grass, and the cattle called to one another across the dusk. Amid it all, they both smiled, not out of courtesy, but truth. A simple smile that dissolved the invisible wall that had stood between them for so long. That night, beside the fire, Margaret poured him a cup of hot coffee. She didn't say thank you, and didn't need to. Instead, she sat a little closer. The firelight danced on the walls, their shadows merging into one. Edward spoke of Boston, of the late-night balls, the stiff suits, the way people there lived by appearance more than by heart. He told it plainly, without bitterness, as if describing a man he no longer was. Margaret listened without interruption, and somewhere in the telling, she realized that though they came from different worlds, both carried the same fracture inside the fear of being forgotten, the ache of having lost faith in others. It was that shared wound that let them understand each other more deeply than any declaration of love ever could. When he finished, she said quietly, "You know, Edward, this land isn't easy to love, but if you're patient, it'll learn to love you back." He looked at her, eyes glowing in the firelight. "Just like you?" he said. Margaret said nothing. She didn't deny it either. She only watched the flames, her lips trembling slightly as though she'd heard something too true to answer. Outside, the moon rose full and gentle over the rain-wet plains, the land, the sky, and the two of them all bore their scars. Yet together they formed a picture of quiet, aching beauty. From that night on, something changed inside the little house. Their voices were no longer restrained, meals no longer passed in silence. Sometimes she'd hear him whistling while feeding the horses and found herself smiling without knowing why. She stopped calling him Mr. Whitmore. Now, he was simply Edward. One morning, as they walked across the fields, Margaret saw him stop amid the golden wheat, eyes bright with something almost boyish. "I think," he said softly, "I'm beginning to understand why they call this the land of rebirth." She looked at him, and for the first time felt no trace of caution, only a fragile, quiet faith. Faith that maybe this time, the one who stayed wouldn't leave. In the days that followed, their silence softened into something else, a gentle kind of closeness that needed no name. When autumn came, bringing the scent of ripe wheat and the sound of horses breathing in the cool mornings, among all the small, ordinary things of life, the seed of love quietly began to sprout, not bright, not hurried, but deep-rooted, like good soil slowly healing two hearts that had once run dry. Autumn came slowly to the wide lands of Wyoming flats, as if the earth itself were taking a long breath after months of storm and struggle. The fields turned gold. The air carried the scent of dry hay, and the wind brushed the barn roof with the rustle of fallen leaves. For Margaret Lane and Edward Whitmore, it was the first true season of peace since their lives had crossed no longer days of mere survival, but days of learning how to live together. Love, for those who have known loss, rarely arrives with noise. It doesn't come with grand promises or burning gazes. It slips in quietly into the smallest things, like morning light filtering through a crack in the door, unnoticed at first, until suddenly the whole room is aglow. Each morning, Edward woke before sunrise. He lit the lantern, opened the stable doors, and checked every horse in turn. One morning, he found Ranger, the same horse he'd once struggled to ride limping. Its leg was cut, trembling with pain. Edward knelt beside it, his hand resting gently on its back, voice low and calm. "Easy, old friend. We've been through worse, haven't we?" Margaret appeared, carrying a pouch of herbs and a basin of warm water. She knelt beside him without a word, extending her hand. He took it, and together they cleaned and bound the wound. When their fingers brushed for a moment, neither pulled away. Only silence and the slow, steady sound of the horse breathing easier. When they were done, they sat side by side, leaning against the stall wall. The first light of dawn filtered through the slats, touching his hands streaked with mud and blood, and her face, calm but far away. Margaret spoke softly. "Thomas used to say that when you care for an animal, it teaches you patience." I think he was right. Edward nodded. "Sometimes I think people do the same." She turned to him then, and for a long heartbeat, her gaze didn't waver. Such a simple line, yet inside, it was a truth she hadn't dared hope to hear from anyone again. In the days that followed, she taught him how to plant seed. Out in the southern field, they worked side by side, Margaret guiding his hands, showing him how to space the rows, how to listen to the sound of soil when it yields. Every movement of hers was measured, deliberate, and Edward, patient, attentive, followed her lead. When the wind caught her hair and tossed it across her face, he wanted to reach out and tuck it behind her ear, but stopped. Instead, he smiled, and that smile made her glance up, catch his eyes, and look away again, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't name. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, mending clothes, counting seed for the next season. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It was warm, whole, as if their souls shared the same small flame. Once, when smoke made her cough, Edward stood and fetched water. She took it, murmuring, "Thank you." He smiled and said quietly, "In the city, people say that 100 times a day. Out here, once is enough." Margaret looked at him, a gentle smile touching her lips. Because out here, people only say it when they mean it. From then on, those small moments became the heartbeat of their days. Edward told her about Boston, about the long nights filled with music and strangers, where he'd felt lonelier than ever in a crowded ballroom. And she told him of winters so cold she could barely hear her own heartbeat, when only wind and memory kept her company. The more they spoke, the smaller the distance became, not by steps, but by trust. One evening, as the sunset stretched gold across the fields, Margaret watched him drive the cattle in. She found herself smiling not because he splashed water on his boots again, or whistled off-key, but because his presence itself made the silence around her feel less empty. She had never believed she could trust anyone again after all she'd lost, but Edward somehow made her believe once more, not with vows or words, but with the quiet things: repairing a fence without being asked, sharing half his cornbread when she was tired, lighting the fire before she came inside. And so, love came not like a storm, but like a seed sprouting deep beneath the soil. Neither of them spoke of it, neither dared name it, but the silence between them had changed it, now carried the sound of something tender, living, real. One cold night, Margaret was tending the fire when she saw Edward still outside, tightening the fence. The wind bit hard, his breath fogging in the dark. She stepped out, laid a shawl over his shoulders, and said quietly, "You don't have to keep working." He turned to her, eyes bright in the torchlight. "I just want to make sure everything's safe. I don't want you to worry." She stood there for a moment, warmth rising through her chest. She said nothing, only nodded and went back inside. But the smile stayed on her lips long after. That night, she sat by the window, watching the faint glow of the dying torch outside, where he was stamping out the embers. The breeze drifted in, soft and cold, and she realized for the first time in years she wasn't afraid of tomorrow anymore. Winter crept in, cold and silent, laying a white blanket over everything. Yet within that quiet, in a small wooden house on the plains, two people who had once come together out of duty now sat beside the same fire, speaking of the future, not in distant dreams, but in plans that felt real about the herd, the crops, the house they might expand. And within those simple conversations, a new vow began to take shape, a promise to keep going together, no matter the storm or snow beyond their door. That winter came earlier than any before. Winds from the Absaroka Range swept down across the plains, sharp as knives, turning all of Wyoming flats into a white, endless sea. Each morning, when Margaret opened the barn door, her breath rose in pale clouds. And Edward, the man who once flinched at a passing breeze, now carried bundles of hay on his shoulders, his coat crusted with frost, without a word of complaint. After months of hardship, the small ranch stood firm against the cold. Smoke curled from the chimney. The scent of burning wood filled the air, a steady heartbeat, proof that the house was alive. And in that warmth, Margaret realized for the first time in years, she was no longer alone. At night, they sat together at the wooden table, the lamplight flickering across pages of worn account books. Edward leaned forward, his voice low and calm. "We could sell part of the dry wheat," he said, "and use it to buy more cattle from Montana. I know a man there well. Used to know he's in livestock trade, a decent one." Margaret thought for a moment before replying, "You think you're ready to bargain with those folks?" He smiled, not offended, just quietly amused. "I once negotiated to buy an entire textile mill. I imagine a few cows won't be worse than that." She looked at him in the yellow light. The city gentleman was gone. In his place sat a man who understood the worth of work, of land, of trust. When snow buried the fields, they worked indoors. Margaret taught him how to mend coats, patch saddles, plan for spring. They no longer said "you and I," but "we." "We'll need more timber. We should save this hay for March." Each time, a small, quiet smile found its way to her lips, fragile, but real. One afternoon, after a blizzard cleared, Edward stepped outside and gazed at the world of white stretching around the ranch. The air was sharp with snow and pine. He turned back toward the house and called out, "Margaret?" You know something, I think I finally found a place to call home." Margaret stood in the doorway, a half-sewn glove still in her hand, watching him, the man standing on the land that had once broken her spirit, now speaking those words with every ounce of his heart. "Home?" she asked, her voice trembling between disbelief and hope. He nodded, eyes lit with a peace she had never seen in him before. "Not just because it's where I live," he said softly, "but because it's where I want to stay." In that moment, the wind stilled. Only the faint whisper of snow falling from the eaves remained, and the gaze of two souls, once strangers, now finding their reflection in each other. That evening, by the fire, the flames danced over Edward's hands once slender, now rough and sun-darkened. Margaret looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've changed a lot," he smiled. "No, I think I've just found my way back. Maybe this place taught me how—" She stared into the fire, a wave of emotion rising, part gratitude, part fear. Grateful that he had stayed, afraid that if he ever left, the fire might die with him. He seemed to sense her thought. "Margaret," he said quietly, his tone slow and certain, "I know you don't need promises, but I'll say this anyway. I'm not leaving. Not in spring, not in winter. Even if this ranch falls apart, I'll still be here." She said nothing, only looked at him, eyes glimmering with firelight. It had been so long since words had made her heart tremble, not from romance, but from truth. The next day, they cleared snow together. Edward slipped, falling backward into a drift, and Margaret laughed a bright, unguarded laugh, rare and crystalline. He looked up, snow in his hair, and laughed back. Their laughter echoed across the white expanse, light and alive, like a song written by winter itself. That evening, Edward threw more wood into the fire. "When spring comes," he said, "we could build another storage shed." She teased. Though she already knew the answer, he smiled, eyes warm. "I said we, because I don't want to separate myself from this place anymore." Margaret turned away, hiding her smile behind a wool scarf. Outside, snow still fell over the roof and fences, but inside, it felt as though spring had already arrived. And so, in the frozen heart of the frontier, they began to write a new chapter, not with ink, but with small, steadfast acts. 2 hands building a fence, a meal shared at dusk, a glance of quiet gratitude when the day was done. They never said it aloud, but between them formed a wordless vow that no matter the weather, no matter what life demanded, they would face it together. For in the end, what they had found was not comfort or plenty, but something far greater, the meaning of staying and the grace of calling a place home. When winter finally retreated, carrying with it the last breath of frost, the vast land of Wyoming flats began to wake from its long sleep. Snow melted into slender streams that wound down the hillsides, joining the little creek behind the stables. The scent of damp earth rose into the air raw, familiar and alive. On the porch, Margaret Lane stood still, her hand brushing against a weathered beam, feeling the warmth rising from the ground, a warmth she had once thought she would never feel again. Out beyond. Edward Whitmore was driving the cattle toward the open fields. He moved slowly, steady beneath the pale sun. Light shimmered on his shoulders, on the drops of dew clinging to the grass. The land, the sky, and the man seemed to breathe in unison. The ranch had changed. The fences stood firm. The new roof gleamed, and young grass stretched green to the foot of the hill. But the greatest change was not in the land. It was in the 2 people who had endured the winter together, who had held on and kept faith. Edward came up the path, sleeves dusty from work. He looked around and said quietly, "See it. The place. It's alive again." Margaret followed his gaze, nodding slowly. "Yes, but this time, it's not just the land. Edward, it's us too." They stood for a moment in silence. The spring wind moved gently, carrying the scent of new grass and the distant whinny of horses. In that soft morning light, she thought of her late husband, the man who once told her, "The land only lives when people believe in it." She looked at Edward wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and knew the words had finally come true. No longer the Boston gentleman he once was. Edward had become a man of the plains. His hands were rough, but his eyes shone clearer than ever. He had found what all his years of comfort and refinement had never given him: the meaning of labor, and the faith of a woman who had once lost faith in everything. Margaret stepped down from the porch and walked beside him through the fields. They stopped before a row of young saplings, fragile, yet unyielding, reaching upward through the cold soil. "Do you think they'll survive?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the same quiet uncertainty she felt about love itself. Edward bent down, pressing the earth gently around the roots, and smiled. "They will, if we care for them. This land's no different from people. It just needs someone to believe in it long enough." Margaret smiled a real, unguarded smile. She lifted her gaze to the horizon, where the sky was brushed with pink and gold. Perhaps love was like that too. She thought it didn't bloom from passion, but from two souls patient enough to endure the barren seasons together. That afternoon, they ate lunch outside. Coffee boiled over the wood stove, cornbread warm and fragrant. Edward poured her a cup, then said slowly, as if the thought had been living in him for a long time, "Margaret, I once ran from my old life, thinking I'd lost everything. But here in this place people call wild, I found something I never had before, a place to belong." She looked at him, her heart easing. "And I," she said quietly, "once believed people only stay when there's something left to take, but you stayed only to give." He didn't answer, only reached out, taking her hand in his. It was rough, sun-darkened, yet warm, and in that simple touch, no further promises were needed. Everything they had endured had already become a vow unspoken. Later, as the sun dipped low, they walked out to the pasture. The cattle grazed in peace. The sky burned honey gold at the edges. The wind lifted the silver strands of her hair, and Edward stood beside her, his gaze stretching far. "You know, Margaret," he said softly, "I used to think love was something you had to find. But maybe it's something you learn by living, by trusting, and by staying when it would be easier to walk away." She smiled, her voice drifting with the wind. "You've learned well, Edward." He turned to her, smiling gently. "And you taught me everything I know." The sun sank, painting the horizon in crimson. They stood side by side in silence, the tender silence of those who no longer need to prove anything. Above them, a flock of geese crossed the sky in a wide V, their calls echoing over the plain. Margaret watched them go, her eyes soft, distant. Then she whispered, "You know, Edward, maybe Thomas can see this too, and I think he'd be smiling." Edward said nothing, only tightened his hold on her hand. When darkness settled over the prairie, the light from their house glowed small, steady, unshaken amid the vastness. To a passer-by, it might look like a single flicker of gold in the sea of grass, but to them it was the heart of a new life, simple, honest, and enough to warm two once cold souls. That night, the wind rustled past the window, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dry leaves. Margaret lay still, listening to Edward's quiet breathing beside her, and she thought perhaps God doesn't give people what they want, but what they need to become themselves again. When she opened her eyes to the pale morning light, she saw the most beautiful thing life could offer: peace. Not loud, not grand, not tragic, just two people, a piece of land, and a love that had taken root, quietly, steadfastly, and true. Years later, people still spoke of a small ranch near Silver Creek, a place where the soil stayed rich no matter how harsh the weather. They said it was because the man and woman who once lived there had worked and loved with all their faith. And if, one misty morning, you passed through those plains, you might just hear a faint echo of laughter, carried on the wind from long ago, where land and love became one, never to part again. Mail order husband. Fled high society to marry a widow rancher, but she's nothing like he expected. Isn't just a love story on the frontier. It's a journey of two people who had to lose everything before they could find themselves again. Amid the harsh winds of Wyoming flats, Edward and Margaret proved that real love doesn't grow from fantasy. It takes root in work, trust, and quiet devotion. When a person chooses to stay through the cold, through the loneliness, that's when the heart begins to heal. Their story reminds us that happiness doesn't always live in cities or splendor. Sometimes it's found in the simplest things: a cup of hot coffee at dawn, a steady hand beside yours, even when life is far from perfect. And maybe home isn't a place at all, but a person who makes you want to come back every day. If you've ever lost faith, if you've ever thought it was too late to begin again, remember Edward and Margaret, because love, kindness, and purpose can always be found if we're brave enough to open our hearts one more time. Thank you for joining us for this story on Frontier Hearts. If you believe love like this still exists out there, please like, share, and subscribe to continue our journey through the wild frontier of the human spirit. Because sometimes, just one small story can warm an entire heart.